Hello everyone and welcome back to the Professional Diploma in Photography here with Shaw Academy. Welcome to lesson number 7 of Module 1, the penultimate lesson of Module 1. I hope I find you all in great form. Did you know that the oldest surviving aerial photograph still to be in existence is James Wallace Black's photograph of Boston taken in 1860 from a hot air balloon. Now, it's the oldest surviving aerial photograph. It's likely not the first one. That was much more likely taken by a very famous French photographer called Nadar, very fascinating, kind of eccentric character in French photography and indeed just photography history. He also took aerial photographs of Paris from hot air balloons, but unfortunately none of his images are still available. So this has the claim to fame for being the oldest surviving photograph taken from the air. A really fascinating photograph from James Wallace Black's hot air balloon. So, welcome to the Professional Diploma in Photography lesson number 7. You are here with myself, William Eames. As I said, I hope everybody is in great form for this penultimate lesson. We've got lots to cover within this lesson, and I do hope that, throughout all of the lessons so far, you really have seen big advances with your photography. Last week, the last 2 lessons were two very important lessons with our apertures and our shutter speeds, and we're going to be having a look at how we bring them together in the next lesson. But before we can do that, we need to learn all about our camera's light meter and how it reads light. So, of course, if you have any questions at all throughout the course, you can ask Morpheus. You can also ask your classmates as well if you're finding that you're not getting the particular types of responses you should be getting from Morpheus. And please do remember to rate those responses as well, so that we can continually go back and improve them and make sure that you do get the right answers. So as I mentioned, we're on lesson number 7. We're going to be having a look at how to get perfect exposures every single time. We're not going to be guessing anymore what's happening when our camera takes a photograph when we're using our automatic or semi-automatic modes. We're going to have a look at how we can also control exposure in these modes as well. It is still possible to control the exposure here when the camera doesn't get it right. And then we'll have a look at how we can take full control in the next lesson. So this is a big lesson in terms of understanding how we can use our fully manual mode. And the first thing we have to be able to do is, of course, identify what type of exposure we have captured. So hopefully this isn't the type of scene you've ever come across in your own cameras. An overexposed photograph, and it would be particularly disastrous on a wedding day like this. But we can identify an overexposed photograph. It's simply there's too much light. And we can tell this because the highlights and the whites are completely overblown, and that means we have lost details in those white tones. If we have a look at the skin tones here, there's just absolutely no details there at all. We've lost all the details here in this kind of hairband. We've lost all the details here in the dress. That would be a complete disaster. And we've also lost details here. So we can identify an overexposed photograph when there is a lack of detail in the brightest parts of the photograph. The opposite of that then, of course, is an underexposed photograph. This is when the camera has not got enough light to get the correct exposure. We've got darker details here, and the information is being lost in the dark and in the black tones. So in this particular photograph, we can see the sky is just dull. It's very dark grey. We're losing details here in the background. Everything just looks flat, and it just doesn't look right at all. So everything is just simply too dark, and this is an underexposed shot. And the correct exposure is one where we've got details in the highlights, where we've got details in the dark tones, and it looks correct to our eyes. It looks as we would see it, and this is really what we're trying to strive for when we're taking photographs through our camera, is to try and get something that looks the same as when we were actually there. So if we have a look at this photograph here, you can see we've loads of details here in the darkest part and the shadow areas here. We've lots of details here in the highlights here as well, in the distant mountains. There's just loads and loads of information here that we can see, and nothing is too bright or nothing is too dark. Now, It's very, very important to say this early on. Don't rely on post-production. Don't rely on editing your photographs afterwards. This kind of mentality of I can fix that afterwards in post-production, it's not a productive way of thinking. Now, post-production plays a huge part in our photography, and we have an entire module dedicated to our post-production in module number 4, pretty much the very end of our photography journey, and that's when it should really come into play. But this kind of idea where you've got an exposure, like, oh, I can kind of fix it afterwards, that isn't always the case. You're going to have situations where you might lose all the details in the highlights, you might lose all the details in the dark parts, and if you don't know how to correct it in camera, you may not always be able to get it back in post-production. So it's not good to have that way of thinking. We should always be striving to get as close as possible to perfection within the camera, and then use post-production as a way of bringing our photographs to another level creatively. So with that in mind, let's talk about stops of light. And stops of light is how we measure light within our cameras. You may have heard this term before, and we're going to demystify exactly what stops of light are in this lesson. And it's a term that I also want you to start using at the end of this lesson as well. So the first thing is, we now know where our shutter speeds and our apertures are located on our cameras. We also now know exactly what our shutter speeds and our apertures do. Shutter speed controls the motion in our photography. Aperture controls the depth of field. But these also control for how long the light enters the camera and the amount of light that enters the camera. Okay, now when we're photographing in our semi and our auto modes, camera will select the aperture and shutter speed combination to get the correct exposure for the scene. And this combination is known as the exposure values for the scene. Now, we'll speak about exposure values much more in detail at the end of the lesson. But that selection that it makes, and in this case you can see it's 4,000th of a second at f5.6, those two combined are the exposure values that have been used to get the correct exposure for this scene. ISO also does play a part in this as well, of course. Now, if we manually choose the ISO, the camera will always choose the aperture and the shutter values based on that ISO that we currently have selected. If you are using automatic ISO, it'll actually include this as part of the exposure value as well. So when we speak about fully manual mode, we're very much going to be concentrating on trying to get the correct exposure using our apertures and our shutter speeds, because these are really the two primary ways we should be getting the right exposure. ISO is a tertiary option available to us, but just make a note of that for now. Now, our cameras see the exact same way that we see. So we haven't really spoken about this in terms of how our own eyes work. We briefly spoke about this when we were talking about how our apertures work, how our pupils dilate to let more light in, and how they get smaller to restrict the amount of light coming in. But how we see is that light is actually reflected off everything around us. Everything that you look at reflects some light, and that is what allows us to see. And if you think about it, when we're in pitch darkness, when everything is completely black, that means there's a complete absence of any light at all. And this is why we can't see, because there's no light being reflected off any objects. Now, the light that's being reflected off these objects does vary. The majority of objects around us reflect to about 12 to 18% of the light that hits them. Okay, so 12 to 18%. You might have thought it was a lot more, but in actual fact, a lot of the light that's hitting off the objects around us actually gets absorbed, and only about 12 to 18% of that light is bounced back off, enters our eyes, and is what allows us to see. Our cameras work the exact same way. Our cameras see light and read light in the exact same way. It reads the light reflected off everything around us, and it reads this light based on this principle that 18% of the light is being reflected off these objects. So the camera doesn't know what's been put in front of it, but it makes an assumption that the light that's being bounced off it is about 18% of the light that hits it, and this is where our light readings begin from. This is where our light meter begins to read the light. Now, don't worry if that seems a little bit complicated right now. It'll make much more sense when we put this into practice. For those of you who are a little bit more advanced, you may be familiar with 18% grey and grey cards, and this is why they exist. They are they're exposure aids. They're to help us based on this principle that 18% of the light is being reflected off any object. But as I mentioned, don't worry too much about that right now. It'll make much more sense when we put this into practice. But this light that's being measured, being bounced off these objects and comes into our camera, it's measured in what we call stops of light. So what are stops of light? Well, a stop in photography refers to a measurement of light. And a stop is either doubling or halving the amount of light in your scene. Anytime we double the amount of light getting into the camera sensor, we increase the light by one stop. So if I say to you, I added one stop exposure to that scene, what I mean is I doubled the amount of light in that particular exposure. Anytime we have the amount of light getting into the camera sensor, we decrease the light by one stop. So double the amount of light is increasing it by one stop, and decreasing the amount of light by half is decreasing it by one stop. Now, we can actually see stops in our camera, and we can see them through the camera's light meter. So the light meter is what we use to measure the amount of light coming into a scene. Now, when we're photographing in our auto and semi-auto modes, the camera uses the light meter as well to gauge how much light there is in the scene. But when we are shooting in fully manual mode, we will have a look at the light meter and we will interpretate what it's saying to us, what it's displaying to us, and we'll make our adjustments based on the information that we have. But first of all, we need to identify the light meter and where it's located. So you'll see it on the back of your LCD screens. It looks something a little bit like this. Here you'll see it, you got a -2, 1, a +1 and a +2, and we have a 0 in the middle. Now, some cameras will go far beyond the -2 to the +2 range and might go -3 to +3, might even go beyond that. It really comes down to the brand of camera that you happen to be using. But the light meter is going to look somewhat like this. We're going to have the 0 in the middle, or a little arrow in the middle. We're going to have some numbers going to the minus and the plus either on the left and the right hand side. And basically what the light meter is, it's a scale. It's like a scale that'll tell us whether we've got too much light coming in or too little light coming in. And we can make our adjustments based on whether there is too much or too little light in the scene. When it's at 0, when it's in the middle, this is when we have what we would consider to be the correct exposure for the scene. And this is where we can see the stops of light in action. Let's break this down a little bit more. So let's learn how to read the light meter. So here we've got our light meter. It's at 0 in this particular instance, and that means that we've got the correct exposure. So the right amount of light in the scene, the light meter is going to indicate 0. So in our semi and our auto modes, the light meter will always be fixed in the center. You will not see it move. If you happen to switch to fully manual mode and you start moving the camera around the room, you're going to see the light meter jump all over the place as the light changes. But when it's in our semi-auto and our auto modes, it remains fixed at the center, because remember, these modes, they just want to make sure that we get the correct exposure for the scene. Now, if I saw the light meter indicating +1 here, this means that it's one stop overexposed, and this means that there's double the amount of light coming into the scene. So remember, one stop, or adding a stop of light, is when we double the amount of light coming into the scene. So if I saw +1, I would know before I even took the photograph that the image is going to be overexposed. Twice as much light is going to come in, so I'd have to make an adjustment based on that. We've got 2 stops over, and it doubles again, so it goes up to 4 times the amount of light, so it multiplies. So we had double the amount of light when it was at +1, but then it'll double again and it'll go all the way up to 4 times the amount of light if the light meter is indicating +2, 2 stops over. So let's just break that down. So +1 stop, that means double the amount of light is coming into the scene, then is needed to correctly expose the scene. +2 stops, that means we've got 4 times the amount of light coming in. That means the image would be very overexposed. And can you take a guess then as what +3 stops, how much more light is going to be coming into the scene if I saw that it was indicating +3 on the light meter? Okay, I'll just give you a second there to type that into Morpheus. But think about it. If 1 stop is double the amount of light and 2 stops is 4 times the amount of light, that was doubling it again. 3 stops is going to be 8 times the amount of light coming into the scene. And that's a huge amount of light. That means our image would be very overexposed in that instance. Because it doubles again. So from 2 stops to 3 stops, we're doubling from 4 times and we go up to 8 times. And similarly then, if it was +4 stops, it would be 16 times the amount of light, and so on. Let's have a look at it on the other side. So here we've got minus a stop under, and remember that means half the amount of light is now getting into the scene. So we've reduced the amount of light in the scene by half when it's 1 stop underexposed. And the light meter indicates -1 in this case. If I saw that it was reading a -2, it's 4 times less light. It's now 4 times less light. That means our image will be getting very dark, and the light meter indicates -2 in this case. Each one of those numbers, 2 to 1 to 0 to +1 to +2, they are a stop in the difference. Now, we also have these little dots here as well. Sometimes they appear as lines. These also do mean something too. These are thirds of stops. We won't be speaking about them until the next module, and there's a particular reason for that. We just want to understand full stops at the moment. So from -2 to -1 to 0 to +1 to +2, each of those is a stop in the difference. So just to review our minus stops. So -1 stop, that's half the amount of light getting to the scene or getting to the camera sensor, then is needed to correctly expose the scene. -2 stops, that's 4 times less light than is getting to the sensor, then is needed to get the correct exposure. And then I'll ask you again, I'm sure you know the answer this time, but -3 stops, how much less light is now coming into the scene? So just type it there into Morpheus. -3 stops, how much less light is now coming into the scene? And indeed, it's 8 times less light. 8 times less light is now getting to the camera sensor, then is needed to correctly expose the scene. So here we've got a photograph of a wall. Okay, not the most exciting photograph, but it's going to serve the purpose for actually displaying these differences in stops as we're cycling through using the light meter. So here we've got our light meter, it's at 0, and I know now that when the light meter is indicating 0, when I can see the little marker is in the center, that I have the correct exposure. So the light meter assumes that we have the correct amount of light for the scene, and all the tones are well balanced. So when I say tones, I mean the dark tones, the light tones, the bright tones, and the black tones. These are all visible. We can see detail throughout all of this photograph. I know it's just some brickwork that we have here, but everything looks correct to our eyes. Let's see what happens if we add 1 stop of light to the scene. So remember now, we're 1 stop overexposed. We now have double the amount of light coming into the scene, and the details are becoming a little bit overexposed. We haven't lost any details yet, but it is just looking that little bit brighter. Now, increase in exposure can make photographs feel a little bit more positive, and we use kind of brighter exposures for what we call high key photography, where we want everything to look kind of nice and bright and airy and happy. So there are also creative decisions to take into consideration when we're adjusting exposure. So technically the correct exposure is at 0, But creatively, we might make that decision to add a little bit more light to the scene, just to make it a little bit more brighter and a little happier. If we go up a little bit further and we go 2 stops over, now remember we have 4 times the amount of light coming into this scene now. It's 4 times the amount of light and things are getting a little bit too much now. We're losing details in the brickwork. We're kind of just seeing the outlines of everything here. It almost looks like a stencil or something. And it doesn't look good. And remember, if the details are lost, we cannot always bring them back in post-production. Sometimes you might get lucky and you can bring them back, but if your highlights are gone or your whites are gone and you try to bring them back afterwards, they're just going to look muddy, they're going to look flat, they're not going to look natural or correct. So you really want to, in most cases, avoid getting an exposure that looks like this. Let's go the other way and let's go to -1 on the light meter. And remember now, we're 1 stop underexposed. That means half the amount of light is now coming into the scene. The image appears a little bit dull and flat. However, underexposing can increase saturation. Now this is a black and white photograph, but it can increase color saturation, make those colors a little bit denser, a little bit darker, and it can add atmosphere to a photograph. So again, technically, it's not correct because the light meter is not at 0, but subjectively, you could argue that this is a better exposure than the one that then is at 0. So again, you can kind of make these creative decisions, but you can only make these decisions when you understand what the correct exposure, is meant to be. You have to know what you're doing before you can start breaking the rules. Now, if we go to -2 stops, remember we have now 4 times less light coming in. 4 times less light is now reaching the camera's sensor. The darkest blacks have lost all detail, and this detail is gone. You're not going to get that detail back. Now, with an exposure like this as well, if you try to brighten it up in post-production, you're going to reveal what's called noise, especially in the shadows. You're going to see this kind of grain be introduced into the photograph, and you don't want to see that. And we're going to talk about that in the next lesson. This is one of the things we have to be considerate of when we're talking about ISO, but it'll also be revealed if we have an underexposed photograph that we try to brighten up afterwards. You're going to start introducing more noise into the scene. So you've got a little bit of leeway when it comes to exposure, but when you start getting into -2 and +2, this is where things get a little bit tricky, and you need to generally avoid that in most types of scenes. Now, we're going to talk about some exceptions a little bit later on, but we should be keeping everything at 0, and then we can make decisions based off after that if we want to add more or reduce the amount of light in the scene. Now, I spoke about exposure values a little bit earlier on in the lesson, and basically exposure values is when we use a combination of an aperture and shutter speed together to get the correct exposure. Now, we can adjust that, and we can change our aperture and we could change our shutter speed and still come out with the exact same exposure. So as you can see here in my example, we could be photographing at 250th of a second. We've got an aperture of f2.8. We're using an ISO of 100, and that gives us the correct exposure. But I decide I want to add a little bit more depth of field to the scene, so I decide to change my aperture to f4. But to compensate for that, to make sure I still get the correct exposure, I need to open the shutter for a little bit longer. So I need to open it now to balance that out to still get the correct exposure. Both settings will give me this correct exposure. So both of these exposure values are right for the scene. But I've changed the depth of field and I've changed the motion in each of these settings. And this is exactly what's happening when we're photographing in auto and semi-automatic modes. Remember, the light meter is always going to be at 0 because our camera just wants to get the right exposure. But the exposure values may change. So, our shutter speeds and our apertures may change, but one will always balance out the other to make sure that we get the right amount of light in the scene. Let's have a look at some examples of this in action. So I spoke about aperture priority before. We're very familiar with it now at this stage. I hope that you've actually been getting a chance to get out there and use use it, especially after the last lesson. But let's see what happens when we're using it and what happens in terms of exposure in aperture priority mode. So let's say we have a shutter speed of 125th of a second. Our aperture's at f2.8. We've got our photographer here again, and we have our line of people. So we're photographing, and because we're at f2.8, we can see we've got a nice shallow depth of field here. This gentleman in the foreground is in focus. Everyone else is out of focus. But I decide that I actually want to increase the depth of field here, and I want to bring it up so that this lady comes into focus. So I'm going to have to close down my aperture. I'm going to have to use a higher f-stop number. So I decide to go to f11, and because I've close down the aperture, my depth of field now is much greater. It's become it's extended a lot more. But to compensate for that, to make sure I still get the right amount of light, my shutter speed has now automatically changed to 1/8 of a second. So I'm still getting the correct exposure for the scene, but I've changed my depth of field. But to compensate for that, the aperture priority has chosen a shutter speed of 1/8 of a second to ensure I still get the correct amount of light. And let's say I decide I want to bring everybody into focus in this scene, so I go all the way to f22, and in this case then, because I've closed down the aperture so small, the shutter speed now has to choose 1/2 a second, which I definitely get camera shake if I was doing this without a tripod. So this is what you need to be careful of when you're photographing using aperture priority mode, is that when you close down the aperture, you might end up introducing camera shake because the shutter has to open for a much longer amount of time to still get the correct amount of light in the scene. Now let's apply this to our shutter priority. So let me ask you a question. So we just had a look at how aperture priority will change the shutter speed to make sure it gets the correct exposure. Can you tell me what you think shutter priority is going to change to make sure it retains the correct exposure? Should be a fairly obvious one. Okay, so indeed, it's going to change the aperture to make sure that we still have the right amount of light in the scene. Let's have a look at some examples. So here we've got a nice flowing waterfall. I'm using a 1/15 of a second, plenty of time here. Slow enough time, I should say, to allow the water to flow nicely through the scene. But it's in terms of light, it's actually quite a long time. So to compensate for that, to make sure that we get the right amount of light in the scene, the aperture is going to be at f16. So the camera decides that if the exposure is at a 1/15 of a second, we're going to need to use an aperture of f16 to make sure that we've got the right amount of light in the scene. I decide I want to maybe freeze that motion a little bit more, so I go to 125th of a second, a much faster shutter speed now, and to compensate for that then the aperture needs to open up much wider. So remember, the lower the number, the wider the aperture, the more light that's coming in, and it now goes to f5.6. Okay, so the exposure values have changed. In terms of the overall levels of light, they haven't changed at all. But the effect in the photograph has changed. It's still got a little bit of movement in the scene for sure, but nowhere near as much as the previous photograph. Let's go and take this a little bit further. So I decided I really want to freeze that water. That photographing at 125th of a second wasn't enough. So I go to 500 of a second, and that's a really fast shutter speed. 500 of a second is a super fast shutter speed. And to make sure we get the right amount of light in the scene, we now need to use an aperture of f2.8. So the camera goes ahead. If I'm lucky enough to have a lens that has an aperture of f2.8, the lens will open up that wide to make sure that we still get the right amount of light in the scene. Now, also, it might introduce a little bit of a shallow depth of field. It hasn't in this particular scene because of the distance of the subject away from the lens. We'll speak about that in a much later module. But the key takeaway here is that the overall level of light remains the same. So we're using different exposure values, different shutter speeds and different apertures for each of these, or at least the camera is changing one or the other as we cycle through each of these settings, and making sure that the right amount of light is still present in the scene. But the effect in the photograph changes. So the motion has completely changed in each of these scenes from changing the shutter speed. But no matter what setting we pick, the camera strives to make sure that the exposure levels remain the same. Now, what about those instances where we're photographing in our semi-auto modes and we need to make a change to the exposure? Sometimes the camera is not always going to get it right. But it is still possible to change exposure when photographing in semi-auto modes. So when I say semi-auto modes, I'm talking about our program mode, I'm talking about shutter priority, I'm talking about aperture priority. In fully auto mode, we can't make any changes. But we can make changes in these semi-auto modes by using exposure compensation. So exposure compensation will allow us to add a little bit more light, or to reduce the amount of light in a scene when needed. Now, when you use exposure compensation, you will actually see the light meter change. So you can dial it up by 1 or you can dial it down by 1. You will actually see the light meter change to let you know what type of adjustment you have made. But it will stay wherever you change it to. So if you apply exposure compensation to one scene, be sure to change it back. Otherwise, the next photograph you take is going to have the same adjustment applied to it. So we can change the exposure using exposure compensation in semi-auto modes. You're going to have this little plus and minus button. We had a look at it before when we were speaking about apertures. But when we're in our semi-auto modes, we can use the plus and minus button. We simply press it in and we adjust the adjustment wheel, and you can either add in a stop of light, 2 stops of light, or reduce the amount of light if needed. Now, we do not use exposure compensation in fully manual mode. The reason we don't use it in fully manual mode is we don't have to, because we dial in those adjustments manually. If we want to change the exposure in fully manual mode, we just do that ourselves. We don't need to use exposure compensation. Now, exposure compensation may also appear as a dial. Really handy actually if you have one of these, where you can just add a stop more light. So you can see here, these are measured in stops. We've got +1, +2, +3, -1, -2, -3, based on the stops of light principle that we had a look at earlier. Really handy if you have that, just to add or reduce the amount of light in a scene very quickly. Now also, just remember as well, with exposure compensation, you are still operating within the parameters of capturing light, which is your apertures, your shutter speeds. So, if you are photographing in aperture priority and you decide that you want to increase the amount of light in the scene by using exposure compensation, it's going to change the shutter speed. It has to get that light from somewhere, so you're still operating within those principles. Now, there's particular cases where the light meter is going to get it wrong and where we are going to need to use exposure compensation. And that's when we talk about things that have dark tones. At the start of the lesson, I mentioned that the light meter and how we see works on this idea, this assumption that objects are reflecting 18% of the light that hits it, and it bases its reading off this assumption. However, it can get this wrong when presented with an object that reflects more or less light than 18% light. So, like this cat here, a dark object on a dark background can appear overexposed with the light meter at 0. Similarly, as well, just so all you dog lovers aren't left out, with white tones, a white subject on a white background can appear underexposed when the light meter is placed at 0. Look at these two photographs side by side. So they're very contrasty. We have one that's dark against dark background and white against a white background. And the light meter simply cannot see both. When the light meter is at 0, what it's seeing is grey. It assumes everything that's in this range is grey. Now, this is something we'll definitely be speaking a lot more extensively about as we move on throughout the course. It's very important to understand. But as we have seen, if we add more light, +1 or +2, we're adding more light to the scene. Everything appears a little bit more white, and certainly in this particular scene we can see here that it is much brighter. And this is the exact opposite. We've got a dark object against a dark background, I should say a dark subject against a dark background, and again having this at 0 would mean that everything appears grey. Let's have a look at this again in more detail. So imagine we took this photograph of our dog, the light meter's at 0. This is probably the kind of result that we would end up getting. Everything is grey and flat and underexposed. This scene is underexposed. It's a white object against a white background. A white subject against a white background. It's reflecting more light than the 18% assumption that the light meter makes. So we need to add more light to this scene. And in this case, we're going to, because we're photographing in our semi-auto modes, we use our exposure compensation and we simply dial up the exposure to +1. Remember, that doubles the amount of light in the scene. And we now get something that looks more correct to our eyes and is the correct exposure for this scene. Let's go back to the cat, and again, if we expose this scene at the light meter at 0, it overexposes this scene. It makes everything appear grey. You can see we're actually losing some details in there and so on, but it doesn't look right. It's too bright. It's overexposed. And again, we're changing a dark subject against a dark background, and we're turning it to grey by exposing with the light meter at 0. So again, we introduce our exposure compensation, and we can now underexpose the scene by 1 stop. And remember, that's reducing the amount of light in the scene by half, and we now have something that is the correct exposure. Now, in truth, these kind of scenarios are going to be fairly few and far between in your day-to-day photography, and really for the majority of scenes we should be exposing with the light meter at 0, and this is certainly something we'll expand on in the next lesson when we're talking about doing our fully manual exposures. But there are going to be situations where, like this, your subject's going to be bright or dark, and you're going to have to make adjustments based on that. Or perhaps you also want to do it for creative reasons as well. Like I mentioned, you might want to add a little bit of light or reduce the amount of light in the scene for creative purposes too. Okay, but if there's one thing you take away from this lesson, is that the correct exposure is when the light meter is at 0, and that we measure the amount of light in the scene by using stops of light. So with that, that's a very, very good foundation for what we're going to be doing in our next lesson, which of course is the Holy Grail. It is our fully manual mode, fully manual. This is a really big lesson, a key lesson of the course up to this point. So we're going to have a look at doing fully manual exposures, how we can take full control over the camera by reading the light, deciding our exposure based on what aperture and shutter speeds we want to use, and using our creative vision to finally capture that photograph in fully manual mode. We'll also introduce ISO as well. It's something that we only introduce at this stage, because really it's not until you get to the fully manual mode that it becomes much more important in our photography. So we'll have a look at that in the next lesson as well. And we finish things off then as well by speaking about RAW and JPEG. And this is going to be our next big challenge, is photographing in fully RAW mode. We'll speak about what RAW is if you've never heard of it before, and why you should be looking to use it very soon in the future. So we're coming to the end of lesson number 7, so we only have one lesson left in this module. And just before we finish up, I just want to ask you a very quick question. I want you to think back to why you signed up to this course in the first place. What were your goals for this course? What did you want to achieve by the end of this course? Why are you here? So, are you a self-improver? Did you sign up to this course because you wanted to just improve your photography, that you just love photography, you want to become a better photographer, you just want to take better photographs? So are you here because you want to complete the full photography course, you want to get your professional diploma, you want to check out another course here with Shaw Academy now. After doing this module, you just want to take amazing photographs and develop your passion for photography even more. Well, if this sounds like you, I recommend that you go with a 3-month or a 6-month membership, and this will allow you to complete the current photography course. You can complete modules 2, 3 and 4, and indeed you can check out another course as well. And I would recommend having a look at my course in Adobe Lightroom, because this will give you the skills then to develop your post-production skills, your workflow, and it'll take your photography to that next level. Perhaps after embarking on this course, you've decided you want to aspire to something a little bit greater. So perhaps you are a self-starter. You're thinking about going beyond just doing this photography course and taking your photography skills a little bit further. So again, you want to complete this full photography course, that's modules 2, 3 and 4, and gain your professional diploma. And you might decide then you want to complete another photography related professional diploma course to take your photography skills even further. And you can then use these skills to further your career and to get yourself maybe that promotion that you've been after for a long time. And if that's the case, if that sounds like you, I would recommend having a look at our 6-month plan, which is our most popular plan for a multi-skill career growth, or perhaps our 12-month plan as well, to give you that extra bit of time to complete the courses and gain your professional diplomas. So you want to complete this course, then have a look at the Lightroom course to help develop your editing skills. The professional diploma in Photoshop is a very valuable diploma as well. This is a 4-module course too, and having Photoshop skills goes a long way in any career, any media-based career especially. You'll find very, very beneficial to have a diploma in Photoshop. And you might decide then you might have a look at video as well to complement your media skills. And maybe from the outset you just had your eyes on the prize, which is to become a professional photographer, and you certainly are on the right track if that is your goal. So again, you want to complete the full photography course and gain your professional diploma, and complete all other professional diplomas related to photography. And this will allow you to enter the industry to become a professional photographer with all the necessary skills that you need to succeed. But you definitely will need to put the work in here. So for that, I recommend going simply with the 12-month plan, the 12-month membership, which will allow you to complete this course: Lightroom, Photoshop, smartphone photography, video and wedding photography. All of these courses will give you absolutely everything that you need to get ahead with your photography career. And even if you've no interest in photographing, say, weddings, we do teach the kind of business side of photography through our wedding photography course. So definitely worth having a look at that if you want to learn how to price your photographs and price your services, all that kind of stuff. But everything that you need to become a successful professional photographer is contained within all of these courses. So you want to give yourself plenty of time to do that. So I definitely recommend that 12-month plan. Now, perhaps you've got aspirations even beyond being a professional, and you want to start a business based around photography. So perhaps you're an entrepreneur and you want to use photography as a platform to build something even greater. And indeed, this course is that platform to help you set yourself up as your own self-sustaining business. So, as you may have guessed, you want to complete the full photography course here, first of all, and gain your first professional diploma. But you want to explore other courses to further your business goals. So, not ones just necessarily related to photography. So, you may want to check out our other professional diplomas to broaden your skill set, to start or expand your own business. And this way, you can be very, very flexible. You can go with a 12-month membership to plan out the courses that you want to take, or maybe you just want to take it month by month just so you can manage things a little bit better. Perhaps you're someone who wants to just control every aspect of their education, their finances, etc., and you can do it in your own time and take it month by month. So you're here on the professional diploma in photography. I do think that you should still complete the professional diploma in Photoshop because, as I mentioned before, it gives you such a broad skill set. You can go into lots of other areas with a professional diploma in Photoshop. But you might decide then you want to check out graphic design. So you're deciding then actually media in general is just something that I want to get into. So you can develop your graphic design skills as well. Social media marketing will help you to understand marketing in the modern era, how you can promote your photography business, your graphic design business, your image industry through social media marketing. Digital marketing will help you to expand on that then as well. So when you start seeing some money coming in for your business, you can grow it even more by learning all about digital marketing. And then you never know, you might actually at that stage have a small business going for yourself and start employing other members of staff. And that's where you're going to want to learn all about leadership and management to help your business grow. It is all achievable through Shaw Academy. No matter what your goals are, we have a pathway. We have the courses that you need to succeed. And remember, many students before you have come through and taken this journey before. So students just like you. And this from Servinio, just listing out a few things that he likes about Shaw Academy. But I think the point that he really is trying here to make is that there is support there, that we actively try to reach out to you to ensure that you are completing your course, no matter what way it is, whether it's through the scheduled times or whether it's through the recordings. If you need more time to complete your courses, we are always here for you to reach out to and to ensure that you achieve your goals. That is all we want to do, is to make sure that you achieve your goals. And Maria here sums it up quite easily. She really likes the courses, she really likes the tutors, and she likes all of the knowledge that she's gaining from the courses, and she is going to be taking a lot more courses with us this year. That's great to hear from Maria. So remember, Module 2, it starts next week. I do hope that you have gotten your place. Have you secured your place already? Remember, time is running out. And do give yourself enough time to complete your courses comfortably. Take out a 6-month or a 12-month membership to achieve your goals. And there is still 50% off on this offer. But do remember, time is running out. It is a limited offer. So you know the drill by now. Our mission is to provide to you a convenient, flexible, affordable, interactive and internationally recognized education. It's higher education at a lower cost. In your own time, learn in your own way. All you have to do is simply choose the plan that's best suited for you. Simply click it. That's it. It couldn't be easier to get yourself 3, 6 or 12 months, plenty of time to complete this course and any other courses here in Shaw Academy. Now for your lesson challenge. So I would like you to purposely use exposure compensation to either or over or underexpose the scene. So this is much more of a technical challenge. I want you to get used to using exposure compensation. It's a very, very valuable tool to us when you learn how to use it. Remember, you're going to be using it in your semi-auto modes. So whether you're shooting in shutter priority or aperture priority, and please use it to either overexpose or underexpose it and post it on to our Facebook page. So well done on completing lesson number 7. Just one lesson left of this module, our fully manual mode. I hope you're all excited, but I'll leave it there for now. Until then, look after yourselves and bye bye.